Okay, I'm Charles Smith. I'm chair of Wales for Europe. Ewan Dafydd is going to be co-chair, just in case I faint or my broadband drops off. He can also speak Welsh, so if anybody uses any Welsh words, he can immediately translate them. I did O level in 1966, so I've forgotten most of my Welsh, unfortunately. Um, so I won't waste any time with introductions. I'll ask Caroline and Anthony to introduce themselves. I'll just mention that Caroline, along with Dominic Grieve, is co-president of the European Movement UK, and Anthony, as well as being leader of the Greens in Wales, is also president of Wales for Europe. So welcome to both speakers. Um, I don't know who's going first. Caroline and Anthony can sort out between themselves, but the format is they're going to speak for what, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and then it'll be open to Q&A. Okay, over to you both then, please. Welcome, Anthony and Caroline.
Thank you, Charles, and especially like to welcome Caroline for joining us, co-president of the European Movement, and as many of you will know, Green Party MP for many years and a former Green Party leader. I think as guest, Caroline, I shall hand over to you to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and I'm very honoured to be with you tonight. So, yeah, as you've heard, the idea was that we would each probably speak for 5 or 6 minutes, and then have a bit of a conversation, and then open up the floor to you for your questions and discussion. And as Charles and Anthony both said, I'm here representing the European movement. Which does have something to thank Donald Trump for, I think, because he's been acting as a very effective recruiting sergeant for us. We now have over 26,000 members, which is a significant increase on this time last year. But Trump, of course, brings huge questions for the UK as well. And in an increasingly dangerous and uncertain world with the rise of populism on both sides of the Atlantic, I think the UK faces some really pivotal decisions about whether we side with Europe or whether we side with an isolationist, authoritarian, and increasingly rogue US. And I would argue that politics is famously about choices, and that at European Movement, we see our job as making sure that Keir Starmer chooses to reject the kind of crude threats that are already coming from Washington, complete with tariffs that will be imposed later this evening, which even the grubby bribe of a state visit hasn't yet deflected, and that Starmer recognises that trying to cut some kind of dodgy deal with Trump in return for distancing ourselves still further from our European neighbours would be utterly self-defeating. So I think the Prime Minister's efforts to straddle between the US and Europe are likely to become increasingly uncomfortable. You know, that fence he's sitting on is going to start giving him some uncomfortableness very soon. And there's a strong argument that we can't afford strategic ambiguity in the face of isolationist, authoritarian, autocratic US impulses, and that we should instead anchor ourselves more decisively within a unified European framework. I think we need to be guided by where our values lie, not by narrow definitions of short-term interests. And so it's clearer than ever, I think, that rebuilding our relationship with the EU is essential if we're to better protect ourselves from the growing economic, security, and indeed climate threats. Having said that, I think we also have to choose Europe to be our special relationship, but we also have to choose sides within Europe, because we can't afford to wear rose-tinted glasses about the EU. We know that the far right is on the rise in the EU too. Far right or authoritarian parties in effect lead governments in Italy, Hungary, Netherlands, Slovakia. The Swedish government is dependent on far right votes. In France, the far right was polling at around 49%. And notwithstanding what's happened with Marine Le Pen just now, it's not impossible that there could be a Bardella presidency in 2027. So I think we need to choose democracy, choose the rule of law, choose protecting the planet, choose tolerance and openness. In other words, choose European values. Present that in some of those right-wing governments, that to me is an argument for why they need us, the UK, as much as we need them, because we can help to bolster some of those values. But if, as a country, we are to change course, if Starmer's much-trailed reset is to have any meaning, then we have to face up to the truth. He has to face up to the truth. And I think end the culture of denial around the biggest strategic mistake of modern times. There is a giant Brexit-shaped hole at the heart of our economic policy, at the heart of the Chancellor's economic plans. In last year's budget, extraordinarily, Brexit wasn't even mentioned. Now, the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, estimates that UK trade is on course to drop by 15% as a result of having left the EU, and longer-term GDP will be down by 4%. And it's very hard to see how on earth this new government will succeed in their plans to rebuild the economy if they can't even bring themselves to admit what is the biggest drain upon it. Instead, we have all of these painful contortions and huge pain for the rest of society as we get yet more austerity being rolled out instead. We have the, frankly, extraordinary scene of a Labour government that would rather cut disability payments or overseas aid or support for families with children or the winter fuel allowance for pensioners than to admit that closer relations with the EU would make us better off, or indeed, instead, in the short term, of at least a wealth tax that would be a far fairer and less damaging option. So that is an incredibly dangerous position for Labour to take, I think, not least when there is a far-right populist insurgency led by Reform UK and Nigel Farage waiting to exploit Labour's weaknesses. So the adoption of austerity that we're already seeing amounts, in a sense, to rolling out the red carpet for reform and setting the table as well. Contrast that with, say, Germany, which is taking bold steps away from austerity towards a kind of strategic Keynesianism, with its security package also including significant investment in the green economy too. So all of that means, I think, that the work of the European movement is more important than ever, and stronger ties between Wales for Europe and the broader European movement is really important too. We have to make the economic case for much closer economic ties, leading as a first step to rejoining the customs union and the single market. I think we need to be making the case for the youth mobility scheme. The government's rejection of this so far makes me so sad and so angry, denying young people an extraordinary and precious opportunity to live and learn in other countries and to welcome young people to do the same here. We need to be making the case for higher environmental ambition and closer alignment, because make no mistake, Trump is taking a wrecking ball to climate action. It's more important than ever that we stand with our EU neighbours in pushing for ambitious environmental policies and to reverse the weakening of our own standards that we saw under the last government and which is now being driven further as a result of Brexit. Because the scale of the law changes post-Brexit means that environmental legislation in Britain is facing death by 1,000 cuts. Take toxic chemicals, for example. There are plenty of toxic chemicals that are banned in the EU that are continuing to be allowed to be used in the UK. When it comes to pesticides, for example, the amount of residue allowed on scores of food types in the UK has soared since Brexit. And now we allow a contamination of our food that is very, very much more than they do in the EU. At the same time, it means our waters are dirtier. Consumer products will be more likely to contribute to global deforestation. So it's very clear that Brexit has already had this downward pressure on environmental standards. And in terms of beginning to reverse that, one of the things that I've been pushing European movement to do is to really push the government to seek to rejoin the European Environment Agency. The EEA, based in Copenhagen, is this pan-European body that collects data on the environment, makes comparable assessments between different countries, really has a big input in terms of the scientific driving of new environmental policy. The EEA, in no way that you could possibly argue at all, infringes national sovereignty. It already has 5 non-EU members. So rejoining the EEA feels to me like a really first step to take towards getting closer to Europe when it comes to the environment. I'm nearly finished, just two last things to say. Because if we are serious, as we are, about seeking to rejoin the EU, probably faster than we might have thought 10 years ago, then I think we need to be honest about the failures of the Remain campaign. I think we need to face the fact that to some extent we allowed Brexit to happen, that we bear some of that responsibility. Now, I know we are up against huge lies and misinformation and likely Russian interference too. But the case that we made simply wasn't compelling enough. The tone that we struck was too often condescending, and too often Project Fear won out over Project Hope. If we are to rejoin the EU, we will need to bring former Brexit voters with us. And I would argue that means less arrogance, more listening. It means making a more compelling case. In the wake of the referendum result, I set up a project called Dear Leavers, and we went to some of those most heavily voting Leave areas, and we sat alongside people and we listened. And we recognised that to the extent that the no vote reflected a view that the status quo was intolerable, people who were voting for that reason were completely right, that there had to be something better, that inequality and powerlessness has been with us for decades and hasn't been resolved. And it's perhaps not surprising that some people mistakenly thought that voting for Brexit might be a way of just shaking everything up and sending a really clear signal to the government, to the establishment, if you like, that things needed to change. So, in conclusion, this feels like a really timely moment for this meeting. It feels that in this new Trumpian reality, the EU has found a new confidence and purpose. Here in the UK, I think the economic costs of Brexit have become ever clearer, and we're also recognising some of the security implications of Brexit too. I think it's significant that conversations about Brexit are at last happening. For example, it's significant that at Westminster we now have an all-party parliamentary group on Europe in Parliament, for which the European movement provides the secretariat. And I know Anthony will say a few words about the new Senedd group. So these are really interesting times, really exciting times. There are some real opportunities for us to shape that conversation about what next for Europe, what next for the UK. And I really welcome this opportunity this evening to kick off that debate.
Oh, Caroline, thank you. That was a very comprehensive overview of where we are right now, and some very good talking points that I'm sure are going to come back up. Just to let everyone know, in case everyone's not sure, the relationship. So European Movement is the UK-wide organisation campaigning for close relations with Europe and rejoining. Wales for Europe is an independent cross-party and non-party group campaigning for the same aims, campaigning for Wales's place in Europe, strengthening our ties in Europe, and ultimately rejoining as and when the political will is there. We sit within the wider European Movement as a sister organisation, working together with them. I think it was in 2021, a partnership was signed between the two groups, and Wales for Europe does have representation on the European Movement's committee. I think that's important because we've got groups up and down the United Kingdom working on this, and coming together, we can both locally in our nations and in our communities, but also across the UK, coming together, speaking, bringing out different messages, but speaking with one voice on this important issue. And I think reflecting what Caroline was saying about where we are today, we had the general election last year, and there was a moment for several months. I mean, obviously, we all welcomed it. You know, some of us had our reservations. Some of us aren't too sure if Keir Starmer is going to deliver the change he promised. But there was a sigh of relief across the country. You know, the clowns had gone, the chaos was over. We could start having conversations. I think it was mentioned at the pro-EU rally just outside Westminster shortly after the election by myself and several speakers. It featured quite heavily in the recent Wales for Europe 5 years since Brexit conference we held in Cardiff. The fact that this is now something we could talk about, conversations at a national government level, a Westminster level. But perhaps I spoke too soon when I said the clowns are gone, because we forgot the big clown was coming back. The big orange clown, we sort of had slightly forgotten he was coming back and what he would mean. And I think as Caroline has heightened, it has just strengthened the need, and it sort of heightens the fact that those conversations that we started to tentatively have after the general election, perhaps we didn't go far enough and quick enough, because we're now in a position where the need for us to have strong relations with Europe, both for trade, for defence, for our place in the world, and ever-increasing isolationist world has never been stronger. And we need our UK government to be brave at this moment and seize this opportunity and be honest about this with people, with the electorate. When they talk about the state of the economy, to be honest about the damage that Brexit did to this, to be honest about the need for us, even before Trump came along, even before whatever horrific news we hear from him tonight about tariffs, we needed to rebuild that relationship, both for economic reasons, cultural reasons, and increasingly now for defence reasons. So to be honest about that. Instead, and I recognise the difficulty of in international discussions and relations and trying to do a deal, particularly with someone like as unpredictable as Trump. But even today, when we know it's over, that all the offers from Keir Starmer, all the pretense of special relationship is still here, we know that the United Kingdom is going to be hit hard by what's coming from Donald Trump. Yet we still see Jonathan Reynolds, the Minister for Trade today, talking up that, yes, we're going to be hit hard, but we'll still be in a stronger position than anyone else to renegotiate a good deal. This is obvious nonsense. We will be a straggler outside. We will be an easy target for Trump and his government. So it just strengthens, and all those things, the environment, international stability, we really need to be rebuilding that relationship. And that's where the work that groups like the European Movement and Wales for Europe are doing. And as Caroline said, I was very proud of the European Movement playing a pivotal role recently in establishing the cross-party group for Europe in the Senate, which had its first inaugural meeting on March the 18th and includes members from Welsh Labour, Plaid Cymru, and Liberal Democrats, and Wales for Europe sit as the Secretariat, and I attend representing both Wales for Europe and Wales Green Party, which now means Holyrood, Westminster, and the Senate all have this important work going on. This work that while our government spokespeople might not be facing up to what needs to be done, we have politicians from all parties who understand this and are starting those conversations, building those bridges. And we need to continue to do that as we push for a stronger relationship with Europe, as we push for rejoining the customs union, eventually rejoining the single market as a full member of the EU. In the meantime, we need to work with sister organisations across Europe, and particularly here in Wales, we can work with other small nations in Europe and autonomous regions, building those relationships, working together where we can. Because as Caroline so rightly highlights, these are unpredictable times in Europe as well. And as Caroline said, our voice is needed as ever, as strongly as ever in Europe. And our colleagues in Europe know that, which is why so many of them want us back at the table. We need to be there building the Europe that we know is possible, ensuring a fairer, greener, safer world for future generations. And obviously, if you want to talk about the environment, you've got two green politicians here. We cannot do this work alone. Air pollution, climate change doesn't stop at the border. We need to be working together. International cooperation has never been more strongly needed, which is just another reason why we must do everything we can to rebuild those relationships. And things like the Youth Mobility Scheme, that was such an act of naivety, is the polite phrase, from the UK government to reject that overture from the European Union. Let's at least rebuild those relationships. And here in Wales, all credit to the Welsh government, the tithe scheme has done a good job in some ways of replacing some of that scheme, but it's still not giving the youth of Wales full access, the full rights, the full mobility they would have under a true youth mobility scheme and rejoining Erasmus. So that must happen as soon as possible. And I'd also like to touch on, it is a difficult conversation for us to have, but looking back at the Remain campaign, and I know we'll get asked questions tonight about how do we rejoin, how do we campaign to rejoin, and what's the most effective way to do that? We need to learn lessons, and we need to be honest about where perhaps we did get these things wrong. And I think we also need to reflect on that as we enter here in Wales. We enter a 12-month election period where Reform looked like doing incredibly well, depressingly well. And I do worry when I look across, and this isn't a comment on across the political spectrum, that we see people rightly wanting to tackle the threat of reform and not learning those lessons from the Remain campaign, and again indulging in Project Fear. They're millionaires, they're sponsored by Russia, they don't care. All these things are true, but we need to speak to the reason that they're resonating with people. We need to speak to why so much of the population, so much of the electorate are tempted by this snake oil salesman and their poisonous rhetoric. Why they fall for this? As a Green politician, I worry deeply about the rise of reform, because one thing that strikes me has been quite noticeable, and they are the veterans of the Leave campaign, we know that. And what is very worrying for me is the way that the net zero agenda, as they call it, has suddenly become the new bogeyman, the new EU. So for decades, it was the EU the fault of everything that's going wrong in your lives. Now they're telling people it's the green net zero agenda that is the reason your lives aren't good. And we all know it's not the reason people are struggling. You know, the reason people are struggling isn't about immigrants. It isn't about, it is about the wealthy elite that are running things. And we need to stand up to that, and we need to challenge that, and we need to be honest in our dealings and tackling with reform and the people who would seek to divide us. Because now, more than ever, we need to be united with other progressives here in the UK and across Europe, as I said, to build that world that we know is possible. I'll stop now because we do want to have a bit of a conversation and leave some time for questions. One of the things I was interested in your perspective, Caroline, is I know we both have talked about this a bit in the past and have ideas around this, because we have a devolved Wales, a devolved Scotland, a movement towards increasing devolution in the nations, up to and including independence for some. And I know that many in Wales see that as the way back to being a full member. For Wales, rejoining Europe and taking its natural place in the family of nations of Europe. And I worry that that can be a distraction. And Will Hayward, political journalist, in his book a couple of years ago, Could Wales Be Independent, which was a very agnostic look at various cases for independence and what people thought it would achieve, did look at the argument that an independent Wales would be able to rejoin the EU. And he accepted that could be a possibility, but the timescales involved in that are enormous. To first get to the stage where there's a referendum on independence in Wales, to assume, and it is a massive assumption, that that would be won, and then an independent Wales would start renegotiating with the European Union, a European Union that would have nation states that would be very wary about encouraging greater devolution and independence of smaller nations. So I think, and then when I look at that and I think about that, and again in Scotland, the Scottish independence movement and Scottish pro-EU campaigners make the case quite strongly that they never voted to leave. But you still have this feeling that we can't achieve this piecemeal. I do believe that the four nations of the United Kingdom have to work on this together. So what I was interested in your perspective, Caroline, is it a lack of, or is it the constitutional ambiguity we have in the United Kingdom? Is that a major problem that holds us back? Because we know now that there's increasing voice in Wales that wants to rejoin the EU as an independent, its own nation. We know that voice is there in Scotland, and we know there are people in England. But perhaps it's the problem who speaks for England, and how do we come together as four nations to work together towards this?
Thanks so much for that question. And yes, this is something that I have spent some time thinking about. And I think you're absolutely right to say that there are some really big constitutional questions here. And one of the things that I look at in my book, Another England, how, notwithstanding the fact that Wales did vote to leave, it wasn't by a big majority, whereas in England, it was every single region outside of London which voted to leave. And so trying to unpack why that was the case, I think is important. But in terms of rejoining, then I agree that although there's a logic to saying were Wales to be independent, then perhaps that would be an easier argument to make. It also, as you suggest, could take us an awfully long time. So it feels to me that we do need to assume that this is going to be the UK as a whole that would be doing the negotiations. But within that, it just feels to me that that Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland need to be accorded far more respect and powers than they've had to date. I mean, it was an extraordinary thing, really, in retrospect, that we didn't set down in the referendum legislation that there should be an agreement in all four countries, and that if one of the countries voted no, then that means you don't change the status quo, and so it feels to me that the way in which the government basically didn't even bother consulting Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland about the form Brexit would take. They just simply assumed that they were speaking on behalf of everybody, and paid no attention at all to the views and the concerns in the other nations of the UK. And we can see what damage that did, perhaps most clearly in Northern Ireland. And unsurprisingly, now with the Sinn Féin government, they are talking very openly about there being a referendum on Irish reunification before 2030. In Scotland, notwithstanding the travails of the SNP, support for Scottish independence is much the same as it has been for many years, at around 50%. And my understanding, at least, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels that in Wales as well, there is a stronger sense of Welsh nationalism also growing. So these are big forces to wrestle with. And I think one of the ways through it actually would be that, as well as doing all of the campaigning we do as Wales for Europe or the European movement, it feels to me that if we were to have proportional representation, if we could actually have a fairer voting system, then we could perhaps have more confidence in generally in the fact that we would be able to demonstrate to our European friends that there is a settled majority in favour of rejoining, because I'm quite sure that they won't want us to rejoin unless they can feel confident that this is a settled view and that it's a view across the four nations. And it feels to me that if we had a fairer voting system, that would be one way of being able to demonstrate that, and to have less volatility between different parties coming and going.
Thanks, Caroline. I think, yeah, a fairer voting system is key to it all. And it is worth highlighting that one thing that might start to change things is here in Wales next year is the first fully proportional election to take place in the UK mainland. Next year's Senate election will have no element of first past the post. It's not perfect. It's not what electoral reformers would like to see, but it's so definitely a step in the right direction. And I think will lead to a more consensual style of politics, which is what we need across all four nations. I think what's really important there, as well as you talked about, showing the EU that we have a settled view. And I think that's very true when we talk about, as the Greens and as other parties do, we talk about rejoining the EU. Plaid Cymru will as well, as soon as the political will is there. And I think that is a massive body of work for organisations and campaigners like ourselves, the European Movement, Wales for Europe, in getting widespread public support for that shift. And that goes right back to what we were saying earlier about how we campaign and how we talk to people about this and how we identify people's issues. I could spend an hour or so just chatting to you, Caroline, but another time I'm sure as well, and I'm conscious of time. So perhaps, Charles, we should open up for questions if people do have questions.
Okay, let's do that. If, like me, you've got a version of Zoom where the raised hand function isn't obvious, on mine, if you look at the taskbar, there's a heart-shaped icon and it says react. And if you click on that, then the raise hand function is revealed. It makes life a lot easier if you can find a raised hand. But if you definitely can't, then just do this sort of stuff. I've got Jeneth Parker with a raised hand there. Jeneth, come in, please.
Hello. Thanks for organising this, and thanks for the really splendid in-person day that you organised as well. I thought it was really great. Really enjoyed that. It was very interesting. And I remember somebody there saying maybe part of the route back into the EU for us at the moment is through security. And I just wanted to follow up on that a minute, because we haven't really talked about Ukraine at all. And I think, I won't say I give Keir Starmer a free pass, but I do think he has got a difficult job trying to, along with Macron and other European leaders, in trying to stop Trump from throwing Ukraine completely under the bus before Europe has a chance to really get its act together. It's quite clear that the NATO alliance is under huge strain, and it's going to change totally. And it just seems to me that that's another reason why actually some of the things that we would have said before Trump aren't necessarily there are more opportunities for us to get involved with Europe now, and they're much more prepared to be flexible because there's a sense of real existential risk from Trump. And it's not just tariffs. I mean, they actually hate the whole EU model. They hate the social standards, the environmental standards. They hate the way that the EU is so globally influential in standard setting because they are dedicated to having no environmental governance and the rule of the richest, with no democratic constraints, it seems to me. So anyway, just a few reflections on that, really. That there seems to be a lot more scope for movement, and Keir Starmer's kind of doing a little bit here and there, but he's still running very scared, of the whole Brexit conversation. So thank you very much, anyway.
Respond now, or?
After you, Caroline.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, Jeneth, you make an incredibly powerful case very eloquently, and I agree with you very much. And it's kind of what I was driving at a little bit, where, it feels as if Trump is trying to push Starmer into moving away from the rest of the EU. So he's trying to kind of exploit that kind of fissure. And I worry that Starmer, although I appreciate it's a very, very hard job that he's got to do, but it feels to me that at some point there will be a choice that he's trying to avoid. I think the way in which Trump has sold Ukraine down the river really helps to crystallize just what's at stake. And I imagine that before too much longer, Starmer will himself conclude, I hope he does, that that we need to be more overt and explicit about throwing in our lot with the EU. And I think, as you say, will that speed up discussions about closer relations more broadly? I think it will. I think it's quite interesting just now, isn't it, around defence jobs, that the EU has come up with an internal defence package. And quite understandably, they've locked us out of it. And yet, we have a lot to contribute in that area. Not that it's something that I normally am happy to champion, but we clearly do. So that could be something that focuses minds, I think, on both sides, both from the UK side and indeed from the European side. And so I do think that Ukraine could be a kind of catalyst in the way that you describe.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with all of that. I think, Jeneth, you're absolutely right to highlight Ukraine did bring this all to the fore, and this didn't happen yesterday either. This has been going on for some time now. Trump has just highlighted the importance of the European reaction to it. I think, as Caroline says, Starmer is walking a very difficult tightrope. But what I do worry about is that he's potentially trying to position himself independent of the EU as the person who's going to come and sort this out. I worry about talk of the coalition of the willing, which is a very nice sounding phrase, but really is implying we can go around the rules. Some of us can do something. And I think what's really crucial to our response to this is that it is within international law and it is united together. And I think it does highlight, and it's a little bit of a corner that Starmer's backed himself into, because on every other aspect of policy, they've avoided talking about the importance of working together with our European neighbours. And now he's acknowledging that while still trying to stay. And then suddenly the shock, the European Union will come up with a deal and we won't be part of it. So I think it really highlights the need that has to be dealt with very quickly. And I think it has also, and I know this is something you agree on, brought a lot of things to the fore that some of us don't like to think about a lot. About what is security, what is defence? And it's been interesting to notice yesterday in the Australians, in the run up to their election, the Australian Greens have put forward quite a comprehensive plan for defence spending, which is something a lot of their members, and would happen to a lot of our members, are a bit uncomfortable that they're even talking about it. But we do have to start having these conversations. And again, that's why we do need to be having them as part of the EU, I would say.
Thank you. Chris Bundy, would you like to come in, please?
Thank you. Thank you both for a very clear view and a very clearly expressed argument for why we're having this conversation. I 100% agree with the fact that we need to align ourselves with those who share our values, of course. One of the difficulties I have as a university professor is articulating what those European values are, because I think, Caroline, you've already said very easily, not everyone in Europe shares our view of what we think European values are, which are left-leaning, probably, because we have this resurgence of the right in Europe. So I just wondered if you could give us the benefit, you will have clearly thought about this frequently, give us the benefit of how you discuss European values and how you operationalize those. How do you put those in a concrete form, other than in some vague policy or procedures? How do you operationalize those European values, and how do you make that argument? Because we need to be making this argument, you know, with the 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 70 and 80-year-olds. And that's something that I struggle with. But I'd welcome your views on that, please.
Should I go first? I mean, I don't want to keep. Do you want to go first this time, Anthony?
Yeah.
Or?
It's a really good one, and it's not just European values. It's quite a few phrases I worry about sometimes that we use so often and on the doorstep. You know, European values, Green New Deal, just transition. There are all these things that mean something to us, and we start to just assume that they're a given. And I think it's such an important time to actually reflect on European values. Isn't this homogenous thing? So I think when people like ourselves talk about European values, we're talking about like-minded people. We're talking about progressive movements, progressive organizations. And I think what we need to see is the proof of those values in the reality of legislation. It needs to come down to what the European Union does, what European governments do, what our governments do here in the UK, both at the Westminster level and at the national level. So we need to see those values as warm values of compassion and caring translated into actual real legislation that makes a difference to people. And that could come down to safe routes for refugees. It comes down to how we treat the most vulnerable in society, highlighted particularly here in the UK at the moment with the discussions around disability benefits. We need to actually start living those values, and those values need to be seen to make a difference to the most vulnerable. We need to be seen to be aware of the gross inequalities at the global level, and to be seen to be tackling those. And I think you're absolutely right. And it comes back to how do we win the argument, taking it forward? How do we counteract the nonsense and the poisonous rhetoric from people like Reform? And it has to be by showing what we mean by those European values, living them, enacting them, and wherever possible, getting that legislation passed that shows that we actually mean this.
Thank you, Anthony. Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that, of course. And I wonder as well if it's worth kind of going back to the to what different EU countries had to sign up to at accession, thinking about things like the independence of the judiciary or the freedom of the media or the rule of law or basic human rights and so forth. Because ironically, the terms of that accession agreement or those accession agreements are pretty tough. And I think they do encapsulate pretty well what I would see as European values. But I think the crux comes in the second part of your question, in a way, is how do we live them? And I think if we were to follow that through, and this might be a controversial thing to say, but maybe following them through would have meant that we would have done something about Hungary still being part of the EU when it's under Viktor Orban, and, you know, cracking down in such a clear way in ways that are illegal and counter to so many of those founding values, if you like, of the EU. So it's easy to kind of, set out the different things that we might think form part of those values. That's the easy part of it. But then actually operationalizing it means that as member states individually, as well as the European Union, we need to do things differently, you know. And I think, for example, under Boris Johnson, certainly we were not upholding those values. I mean, we had a prime minister who prorogued Parliament. If that had been happening in a third world country, we'd have probably launched a coup or something. When it comes to our own media, there are big question marks about, you know, who's funding it and how independent that is, and certainly the independence of the Brexit referendum itself, with all of the Russian money coming in. So it feels to me that underneath your question, actually, there are quite a lot of implications that it has if we are to really make those values mean something, rather than, as Anthony says, just being kind of words on a piece of paper that we glibly repeat. But I certainly think the EU needs to start thinking about how they operationalize it. And one thing is, whether or not you have a far right government in power, and that's obviously of a deep concern to us. But then I think looking at what they actually do and where they are contravening those values, if you like, undermining those values, then I think there needs to be some kind of EU action as a result.
Thank you. James Hollis, please.
Yes, thank you for that. Anthony and Caroline, thank you for your pictures. I thought they were very great. They were very good to hear. I just wanted to pick up on what Anthony mentioned, and which will probably segue into what I have to say, and that is, I'm glad to see that, when you sort of mentioned that, we're all progressives here. I just wanted to sort of add a sort of asterisk to that, Anthony, to say that actually not all members of the UK European movement are progressives. I am not a progressive. I am a conservative, and I am very pro-EU. I want us to return to the European Union, okay? My concern, however, is that I don't feel that individuals such as myself, we have fantastic Dominic Greaves, who is, co-vice president along with Caroline leading the movement, but I don't feel that conservatives such as myself are given enough representation within this movement. And the reason I say that is not self-serving. The reason I say that is because at the end of the day, the reason that we lost that European Union referendum was that the conservative vote went for the Leave side because they felt, but because the key buzzwords, you mentioned this at your fantastic talk, Caroline, about, when it came to Englishness and identity, those key buzzwords of loyalty to your nation, authority, all of those buzzwords were not covered properly by the Remain campaign. So what I would just like to ask is, what place do you see for individuals such as myself, if indeed you do see a place for someone like myself in your fantastic movement? And I just wanted to also say that, what do you recognise the fact that conservatives of the old style conservatives, who until they completely lost their way and took leave of their senses, should be properly represented within this movement? I have nothing against Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. I think the rest of politics is great, but I'm afraid if you're going to listen to them, I'm afraid we're not going to get returning to the European Union anytime soon. I feel really this needs to the baton needs to pass down to the next generation of conservatives. So I'd just love to hear both of your perspectives on that. And thank you for listening to me.
I think your question is incredibly well made, and I'm glad you raised it, because I feel hugely strongly that there absolutely is a role for you and people like you. And if there isn't, then we really are stuffed, frankly, because we need a serious majority in this country that would have that settled view that I spoke about earlier. And I talked about handing down to a fresh generation, which was very going to make. I was about to highlight my complete admiration for Michael Heseltine, which is kind of going back a few generations, but that kind of conservatism and the way that he has brought all of the kind of authority that he has to the European movement when he was president. And I think Dominic and I are both very aware that we've got very big shoes to fill. He did a great job in he framed the challenges that we face, the kind of existential challenges that we face, and brought with him, I think, and I hope, a good number of people from the Conservative Party. One of the reasons that I wanted to do this job as a co-presidency with Dominic is exactly to demonstrate the breadth of different views that come together within the European movement. And I think you rightly challenge us in terms of how we reflect that in the movement. I must admit, I'm not yet terribly familiar with the council and all of the different kind of structures, and I don't know if it is the case that Conservatives aren't well represented there. But if it is the case, then we should do something about that and encourage Conservatives to stand, because this is either a fully cross-party campaign or it doesn't work.
Thanks, James. That was a really good and timely point, and thank you for pulling me up on sloppy language. Is always appreciated. It's again going back to what we were saying earlier about overarching phrases, progressives. I chuck it around loosely. I don't mean left or right by that. I would say about social values. I would say people like yourself are very welcome, are essential to the success of this movement. I think I'm fairly certain we have Conservative members of Wales spirit, and I know very strongly that the people who were putting the cross-party parliamentary group together in the Senate were very, very keen to have Conservative representation on that. And that offer is still open. A Conservative Senate member would be very, very welcome, because you're absolutely right, with all voices on this. And it's good to highlight as well because I find here in Wales and in the Cardiff bubble, Conservative like David Melding is sorely, sorely missed. I've been on so many hustings and panels with David, and there is so much. So often we look at each other and think, is there anything we don't actually disagree on? We don't agree on. So I think it's a really timely point because we need everybody, and we need, again, I was saying, we need to strengthen those voices within all the parties. So people like yourselves within the Conservative Party need to be strengthened. There needs to be that confidence to come out for people within the Conservative Party to say, hang on a minute, why haven't we got a representative on that cross-party group in the Senate? What are the Conservative group in the Senate playing at? Why aren't they taking part in this? So I think you highlight a very good point, and thank you for pulling me up on that, because this, to include everyone, I have to talk about the language. And I think you're absolutely right. The language of the Remain campaign did sort of give the message that a whole swathe of people's votes didn't matter because this block of people were going to win it. And I think the lesson we learn from that is that we do this together or we don't do it at all. So thank you.
I don't know what's happened to Charles, but should we go to Richard?
Yeah, Richard next.
Well, thank you, Caroline.
I kept myself off. Richard Jones, come in, please. Sorry
thank you, Caroline and Anthony, both for your comments today. First, can I say that actually I will confess I'm an ex-Conservative. I left the party when Dominic Grieve got booted out of it. And that was just too much for me. But actually Michael Heseltine, for those of you who live in this part of the world, is speaking on the last day of the Hay Festival on his book From Acorns to Oaks on the 1st of June, and I'll be going over to hear him there. I wanted to pick up on two other comments really with questions. First, on European values. I am a member of the European Movement's Education Working Group, which is meeting again in a fortnight's time. And a fortnight ago, we looked at a possible mission statement, which included these comments: to raise awareness of and support for European values and identity within the UK by campaigning for these values. And I made the point that actually it's not European values so much as they're shared common values that we all belong to, that we help to formulate and so on. Just by, and I talked about shared common values of including democracy, rule of law, human rights, language out of from a Japan society. I worked in Japan, and I'm a member of the Japan Society, and they had a quarterly webinar at lunchtime today with Bill Emmett, a former chair, and Jesper Kohl in Tokyo, and Kono Taro, who is a former foreign minister, defense minister, minister for digital communications, and so on. And he talked about the Western values, which we were espousing against Russia, China, and even the US at the moment, of common values, Western values, and common values of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And I think those are core values which we do need to be pushing. That you may want to add more issues within Europe, but I think those are key things. The other thing that came up though in that conversation with Bill, Jesper, and Taro Kono Taro was about Trump, because Trump is he's only 2 months in, and we're still in quite early terms. And Jesper used the words hanabi, which is Japanese for fireworks, and Kono later said fireworks. And we are seeing a lot of fireworks at the moment in terms of how Trump engages with what's going on. And in time, that will settle down a bit. We've seen already today that.
I have a question because
the question is.
One more.
I'm sorry. The question is how will that affect things? Do you think that American policy will settle down? Will that change things? We're about to have got Liberation Day at 9 o'clock night, but it's we wait to see what happens, and no one knows what Trump's going to do until he's done it.
Really briefly,
but will there be some?
Yeah, I think really briefly, Trump helps us define our values, doesn't he? Because it's such a clear example of everything we're not and everything we don't want to see happen. So it does help define those, and I think crucial for us now in the years coming forward is to support in every way we can the people that rise in opposition to Trump in the United States. and internationally, because it's deeply worrying. And the fact that it is a joke is equally worrying, because we sort of laugh it off and, oh, look what he's done now. But deeply, deeply troubling times. And I think does just emphasize the need for us to really drill down, identify what our values are, and to stand up and fight for them.
Just very quickly on the point about
Caroline, please. Yeah.
Quickly on the point about will the Trump fireworks die down? I'm worried that we get distracted by the fireworks, whereas behind the scenes there are people who are systematically dismantling the US state, and the stupidity of Trump's latest statement or whatever he's just recently done. But I think we should be under no illusion that there is some very serious and very systematic destruction going on, and we've seen it in the environmental field, but it's also clearly in human rights and social rights more broadly. And I think that document, that 2025 document, what's it called? Heritage
Project 25.
Project 25. Thank you. Yeah, that basically says do stuff really fast and just keep throwing things on the table to kind of be distracting, and that is exactly what Trump is doing. But I don't think that means that after he's finished doing that he's going to calm down. I think that means that by that time so many of the checks and balances that were left in the US will no longer be left, and then the serious work of total dismantling of so much of what we've taken for granted from the most powerful country in the world will be dismantled, and it'll be a very scary time. I'm sorry to be more depressed, but I don't think that he's going to calm down. I think it's that the destruction isn't happening.
Thank you, Caroline. Time for one more question. We will finish at 8. Jason, you had your hand raised.
I did, yes, but it wasn't really a question. It was just to acknowledge James's input and say it was really heartening to see that we've actually got someone who is a Conservative currently, keen to be involved in what we're doing and keen to see us, work towards rejoining the EU. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that I believe it was the Conservatives that took us into the European Union originally, albeit under the guise of the common market. And I think the drivers behind that were both the concept of shared values, but also the economic benefits of belonging to a trading bloc much closer to home than trying to do deals backwards and forwards across the world. And I just think that that's something that we still need to keep hold of, and we still need to push, because ultimately, if we actually look at the stark reality of the changes in prices that we're experiencing on the high street between 2016 and now, some blame is thrown towards COVID, other blame is thrown towards the Ukraine war, oil prices, etc. No, the reality is we're out on our own now, and yeah, we may well become victim of Trump's tariffs. So, like I say, it wasn't a question, but I've had my say.
Thank you, Jason.
Then just say, do you agree at the end of it? That's what they always do in Parliament. And
would you like to sum up, Caroline and Anthony?
Well, and it's not really a sum up, but I just do want to agree with what Jason just said, and I think that the dangers and the coldness of being on the outside now become more apparent for increasing numbers of people right across the political spectrum when they see that in a world that is a lot less certain and a lot less safe than it was even 10 years ago, that being on your own is not a very comfortable place to be. And I think the point that you made, Jason, about the economics, and I was looking at an article by Peter Kellner, and he was could have been keeping pensioners warm in the winter and improving our schools and hospitals, and not meaning that we were cracking down on people with disabilities. That could have been a different scenario, and I think that is something that an increasing number of people are recognizing. So as I say, these are kind of scary times, but I think that they are also an opportunity for us to really, really push the kind of agenda that's at the heart of Wales for Europe and the European movement. And I think we should do.
Yes, Caroline. Anthony?
I think, just to echo that, definitely scary, challenging times, but also an opportunity. And we need to start by getting political leaders at every level to acknowledge the damage that's been caused. That's the start of moving back. It's to actually acknowledge, and that should be easier for them now that the realities of what being alone in this new world become even starker. I think that's where we need to be pushing our leaders at the moment, to be acknowledging that we need to start making that change towards rejoining, and we can't start that until we acknowledge that. So I think it's been really valuable this evening. The questions, as always, really stimulating. I know we could carry on for another hour, and I know we will in meetings up and down the country, at rallies. And I'd just like to thank everyone here for everything you're doing. Keep up the good work. Keep working in communities. Keep working them across the nation. We've got to carry on because we don't have a choice. We have to get our place back in the EU.
Okay, well, many thanks to you, Anthony, and to Caroline for being our guests. Many thanks to everybody for turning up and for the questions. I wrote a master's thesis in the early 1970s, around about 1973, and I quoted Professor Joseph Frankel, who was Professor of International Relations at Southampton. And he said that the special relationship died in the Suez Crisis of 1956. Unfortunately, since then, I've written about 30 or 40 letters to the press complaining about this ridiculous phrase, the special relationship. I've thrown most of them in the bin after getting off my chest, but I think I've had about half a dozen letters published in the Western Mail criticising this ludicrous idea of the special relationship. And if the orange blob does one favour for us, it's that it should kill that stupid phrase stone dead once and for all. It'll take a little bit longer for Mr. Starmer or Sir Keir to get the message, but maybe he will in due course. Anyway, on that note, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
It's been
Thanks
a
so
good
much for coming.
meeting. Thanks a lot. All the best.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.